thrilled to introduce Jeff, who's a great friend and a huge supporter of the center. As you can see in the program, uh, Jeff Mast was born in Detroit, spent much of his career in the metro area, Royal Oak specifically, working in the municipal civil engineering area. And he last presented at the conference with Michael Valentine in 2015 on a program which I still remember, A Journey into Photo Charters. So he's been an avid photographer with many awards for his photographing railroads for more than 50 years. And Jeff is going to present the photography of John Bjorklund, who we actually knew very well. And when Jeff and I were talking about this earlier in the week, I found out that Jeff and John were part of a Tuesday night slide group for many, many years in the Detroit area, which met almost twice a month, sometimes in Windsor and sometimes in Detroit. And besides that, he and John themselves would go out photographing trains. And before I turn it over to Jeff to present John's work, I just want to thank Jeff also, not only for presenting today, but he's been part of the program committee at the center for more than 15 years. And that committee not only helps to develop the content for all these conferences, but actually behind the scenes puts on the programs backstage, which when we're live, say at Lake Forest, involves making sure the audio, the visual, the wires are all connected and so forth and so on. So while it's all gone off flawlessly for us in the audience, there's been a lot of time when Jeff and his crew have been running around like crazy to make sure everything works. So I really want to thank Jeff for his contributions there and making what has often appeared to be a flawless program for the rest of us. So thank you, Jeff, for taking the time out and presenting today.
Thank you, Bon. Appreciate that.
Hey, Jeff, you should be good to share your screen now.
Oh, here we go. You have the right one, Haley?
That's the right one.
Okay. Well, let's get going. Thank you, Bon. Thank you, Haley. I would like everyone to take the time to visit the center's collections portion of the website for details of John's life and to browse through his image collection. Now let's see some trains, the photography of John F. Bjorklund. This wonderful sunset glint of an eastbound Canadian national freight west of London, Ontario in February of 1978, for us friends of his, is typical of the imagery we expected from John Bjorklund. We lost our good friend in 2005. This program will focus not only on his work, but also how he influenced his friends as a person and as a fellow photographer. My friendship and later travels with John Bjorklund began in 1972 at the Michigan Railroad Club meeting in downtown Detroit at the old Pickford Shelby Hotel. This is where I first saw John presenting one of his many great slideshows. Afterward, I was eager to get out and see these locations and railroads I had observed in John's shows. In those early years, John was traveling quite a bit with his then Ford co-worker, Jim Thomas. I soon began to travel with John on day trips to either Ohio and Ontario. In Ontario, there were wonderful via passenger trains as well as freight trains on the CNCP, CNO, and NNW, the latter two running between Windsor and Buffalo. The nice thing was there were still open train order offices, and train information was easy to obtain. Add the fact that John already knew most of the operators from his previous visits. Here's proof of John's ability when talking with crews to get this in-cab view as a westbound blasts by with Alcos. John loved to include people in his shots. He tried for as many railroaders as he could, but he was also shooting us all the time. And seeing these images brings back some of the great memories, such as the stock pens at Appin with the late Jim Coughlin, the operator hooping orders to a Buffalo-bound N&W freight at Glencoe, and even yours truly following a successful extra flag hunt along the CPR trackage. In the fall, stock car shipments of Western feeder cattle would start to arrive in southwestern Ontario for the winter. We always tried to catch these movements in trains. All we usually found were the empty cars spotted at the pens at Bothwell, Appin, and Arkwood. Unfortunately, these shipments ended in 1986. However, John on a solo trip hit the jackpot, as evidenced here with CP Train 70, with a couple big MLWs trailing an SW 1200 pup, having picked up a bunch of the stock empties at all the aforementioned pens. His early work showed the direction he was headed with the composing of his images, always filling them with all the railroad-related items he could squeeze in, such as this Canadian Pacific westbound at Chatham with run-through C&O power, and his stubborn refusal to give in to the limitations of ASA 25 or 64 film with low light, here with this Canadian Pacific eastbound at sunset. Here, Snowcake Grand Trunk Western Caseville line power has returned from the drift zones back to Pontiac, and later a northbound plow extra is clearing the same line, shown here crossing the C&O Diamond at Clifford, Michigan, as a crewman lines the swing arm control gate. Here we see the passage of time at one location as GTWFs arrive in Durand, Michigan in 1971, and a little over a decade later as a northbound Ann Arbor freight with former Green Bay Western RS2s. It was John's unique style and flair for getting it all in his shots that made me look deeper into how I composed and shot my photographs. One of John's signature styles in shooting was using some sort of prop to bolster the scene. If not a railroad fixture, it would be a building, old car, truck, tractor, or animal. Here the DT&I puller exits the tunnel from Windsor, Ontario into Detroit, passing the famed Michigan Central Depot. But I think he liked to use animals the absolute most, mainly cows. I cannot remember how many times I would chuckle as John would walk off down the road to incorporate some cows into his shot, such as the Sioux Line train near Fond du Lac in May of '75. Here the massive signal bridge at West Detroit Tower on the former New York Central as a C&O Buffalo train arrives in Detroit, or west of Detroit at the interlocking tower in Romulus as a Saginaw-bound C&O Jeep 30 rolls north, crossing the former Wabash, now N&W. John was always involved with the Michigan Railroad Club, and when they ran fan trips, he was always along or trackside. Here, GTW 5629 arrives in Jackson, Michigan in 1968 on the New York Central Main Line, having brought an MRC trip over on the Grand Trunk Western Jackson branch. It was John who accompanied me to Cincinnati in the early 80s, then to present a dual projector slideshow for the Cincinnati Railroad Club's annual banquet. I was extremely nervous just prior to my presentation, and it was John who calmed me by saying, "Now, Jeffy, you'll do just fine." And it worked, and I'll always appreciate his words and encouragement. One of John's favorite locations in Ohio was in Quincy at Morgan Tower, located at the crossing of the old Big Four New York Central on the DT&I. For here protecting that interlocking were giant pitchfork blades, side by side multiple semaphores on tall masts. They were magnificent, and John did very well shooting them on his many visits. One of the most productive weekends outings with John was a trip to central eastern Ohio with Ron Peiscore and myself back in 1977. We were to shoot the old PRR Panhandle St. Louis line, a spectacular piece of double-track railroad that in the early 50s the Pennsy had daylighted approximately 8 tunnels, which were now spectacular deep cuts. Some cherished moments here and the usual John random friend shots. Once again back to Ontario with a CN excursion with Mountain 6060 approaching the old depot at Winona. Or the obligatory detail shot. He took plenty, as here with CPFA2 cab unit with its cast iron builders and class plates mounted above the brake cylinder. Here we find relatively new Canadian National M420s westbound at Paris and an old Sperry Rail Service Mack bus along the CPR, most likely very near the end of its service life. A late season snowstorm in April of 1975 resulted in this candy striped treat as a CP westbound nears Kent Bridge. Just down the line, John caught the crew working to clear the switch to get in the siding for a meet. And also he caught one of only 2 GP30s on the Canadian Pacific here resting at the Roundhouse in Windsor, Ontario. Here we find some classic views as a CPR hostler talks to him while servicing units in Windsor, and an engineer answers questions in classic bibs while on the siding for a meet. One of the earliest examples of John's work is this 1966 view of a Soo Line passenger train leaving Minneapolis. From this point, I will be reviewing the thoughts and memories of John from his friends. If a specific image is not addressed, there will be a caption giving the location and date. Those friends are Jim Thomas, the late Doug Harrop, Mike Schaefer, and Michael Valentine. One of John's greatest interests was that of the Milwaukee Road, which he covered with precision. Here we have Bicentennial SD40 leading eastbound near Bow Bridge, South Dakota in May of '78. And here are the reflections of friend and constant sidekick Jim Thomas of his travels with John. The Milwaukee Road's electrics of its Rocky Mountain division survived, but the end was in sight and we had to get them before it ended. We agreed on going west the following July. Planning a trip with John was an exercise in enthusiasm and intrigue. We studied maps, books, and photo captions. We called everyone that we knew that had traveled to this part of the Milwaukee Road. On July 7th of 1973, our plane touched down in Great Falls, and soon Elaine, my wife, John, and I were driving south to intercept the Milwaukee. We reached the Canton area at Ringling, and all was quiet. We headed east towards Harlowton, where we were to spend the night. As we approached Martinsdale, green block signals went to red. The section man confirmed that a westbound was imminent. Soon Double Joe's and an SD7 filled our viewfinders. We followed our train west to Ringling in perfect afternoon light, catching it numerous times as it climbed to the summit of the Belt Mountains at Loweth. This was going to be a great trip. For almost a week we moved westward, eventually reaching Avery, Idaho. The Milwaukee rewarded us with great train chases across a spectacular landscape of river valleys and mountain passes. The Union Pacific and Burlington Northern added to the action. At Avery, we left the Milwaukee and drove north to Nelson, British Columbia to see the Canadian Pacific's last stand of Fairbanks Morse Power. Mike Schaefer had provided the inspiration when he showed his slides of Nelson earlier in the year. Like the Milwaukee Electrics, the FMs, more correctly CLCs for Canadian Locomotive Company, were not to be missed. C-liners and H-liners in new and old paint worked and were maintained out of the Nelson shops. The CP C-liner cabs had no nose MU connections. Therefore, they would either lead or trail in the locomotive consists. John loved detail shots, as here with the CP Trainmaster, showing off its distinctive offset bell mount. The branch out of Nelson from Castlegar to Trail was served by a turn. Here, 3H1644s and a Trainmaster are southbound approaching and crossing the Stony Creek Bridge near Trail. Exactly 6 years later, we were on the West Coast after more Burlington Northern and the Milwaukee's Coast Division. The end of the Milwaukee Pacific extension was approaching. The electrics were long gone, second generation EMDs and GEs pulled most of the Milwaukee freights. Slow orders were everywhere, and there was no evidence of any scheduling. We worked the line westward, starting at Lynd, Washington, where the Milwaukee crossed over the former Northern Pacific. By now, John was well on his way to documenting all of the Milwaukee Road. His routine was to take 2 or 3 week vacations from Ford each summer to photograph. He would concentrate on an area of the country or a railroad. It's quite amazing how much of the country he covered in the 70s and 80s, and the Milwaukee Road was often the target. Until the end, his memory was vivid, especially when recalling the names of towns and train operations. The great irony of writing these memories is that I can't call John to help me recall the details. The trestles of the Milwaukee on the west side of the Cascades were of high interest. we hiked high above Mine Creek Trestle and set up for an eastbound. The light was dramatic. We waited hours and watched as our light changed and the shadows ruined our shot, and still no train. With nothing better to do, we waited until our train finally appeared at dusk with 4 SD40s. Down to the last day and still no trestle shots. As always with John, there was no discouragement. A call to the dispatcher in Tacoma the next morning yielded good news, westbound, and if we scrambled, we might make it. For reasons of light, we chose Hull Creek Viaduct. Milwaukee 25 led more SD40s past us just minutes after getting set up. Before leaving, John set his camera on a tripod and recorded the two of us on Hull Creek Viaduct. This was to be our last day ever on the Milwaukee Road West. Now we're going to head east. Besides the Erie Lackawanna, one of his favorites, the D&H seemed to have it all in the early 70s. Great scenery, PAs, sharks, sentries, and a railfan-friendly management. When the D&H dusted off its PAs and announced intention to run a fan trip, plans were made to be in Binghamton in September of '73. We drove through the night from Detroit, arriving in Binghamton at 3 a.m. The morning came with cloud cover breaking in the sunlight as a front moved through. The day remained mostly sunny, and the chase from Albany and back was one of the best ever. The hook was set. We were destined to make the D&H a cause. A year later, it was the PAs that drew John, Mike Schaefer, and myself back to Pennsylvania and New York. 2 PAs were to pull fans from Wilkes-Barre to Oneonta and back. The chase went well, and at day's end, we were high atop Starocca Viaduct, waiting for the southbound PAs to pass beneath us. Soon our train showed up just as the sun broke through the cloud cover, revealing a silver train gliding through a landscape of fall foliage. In '75, the D&H hit another one out of the park by purchasing 2 Baldwin Sharks. In July, at his suggestion, John and I were again in Binghamton, this time to shoot the Sharks in service between there and Sayre, Pennsylvania. Fantastic was the way the Sharks looked and sounded that day as they worked their way west near Waverly on the Erie Lackawanna. The Sharks weren't the only draw to Binghamton area. There were run-through freights with power provided by the Lehigh Valley and D&H. Savor the moment John caught as Lehigh Valley 628 leads NE84 under the Starocca Viaduct. Often Lehigh Valley trains were hard to find, but not so in Sayre, Division Point. Sayre was a sure bet, with many C420s, including the early Donald Duck or Yellow Jacket colors, awaiting their next call. Here, Lehigh Valley 640 is eastbound at DuPont, Pennsylvania. This is typical of John's use of architectural features in framing images, as the bridge structure here. Thank you, Jim Thomas. From here, we will travel west to the memories of John traveling with the late Doug Harrop. John Bjorklund and I first met trackside in Klamath Falls, Oregon in the spring of 1975. We were just 2 guys traveling alone shooting trains. At the time, we couldn't have seen it happening. However, a 3-decade-long distance friendship was born. It grew exclusively through letters and phone calls. I was from California and later Utah. We started trading slides that very summer. He taught me a lot about good photography just from looking at his slides. We hooked up infrequently, perhaps 8 or 10 times during the 30 years of our friendship, except for 2 times I visited him at or near his home. He always came west and allowed me to guide him to places such as Tehachapi, the Mojave Desert, Donner Pass, and some of my favorite locations on Soldier Summit. He absolutely loved the West. On our second trip together to Montana in 1979, I got the impression the second day out that he would rather eat than shoot trains. Nothing could have been further from the truth, as I later learned. More than anything else on that trip, he wanted a shot of a Milwaukee Road train crossing the Missouri River at Lombard. After a night in Three Forks, a call to the railroad office alerted us to a westbound out of Harlowton. I wanted to drive right to Lombard, but John insisted on having breakfast first. We finally arrived at Lombard, hiked across the bridge, and waited. 2 hours later, we faced the fact that the train had already passed while we were driving in. I told him not to worry, we would still have a good day, and we did. I then took him to my all-time favorite Milwaukee Road location, high up the hill overlooking the tight horseshoe curve above Vendome and Pipestone Pass. He was thrilled to shoot the westbound as it struggled up the hill with a helper cut in mid-train. Later that week, we shot Milwaukee trains meeting at Iris, Montana, as a BN local also rolled through on the former Northern Pacific, Maine. This location inspired him later that year to commission artist Larry Fisher to create a painting, that of a westbound Milwaukee Road Olympian passenger train powered by a Class EP3 electric, overtaking a steam-powered Northern Pacific freight. One of the finest pieces of railroad art ever produced, in my humble opinion. 2 days later, I learned that John, perhaps chagrined by the Lombard experience, trying to beat a Milwaukee train eastbound between Adair and the summit on St. Paul Pass. "Come on, Harrop, let's move this thing," he yelled. I don't know what the road over the pass looks like today, but in 1979, it was a little more than a fire road. We nearly trashed our rental getting to the top, but we did beat the train. His burning desire to get the photo came back to me again as we bounced into the east end of Woodford on Tehachapi Pass in April of 1989 to get one more shot of the Southern Pacific oil cans before moving on to the loop. We took the pictures, ran back to the car, only to discover the doors were locked and the key was still in the ignition. John grabbed a rock and handed it to me. "Bust out a window. We have to beat the train to the loop." "No, John, we can't do that, as we have a 500-mile desert drive back to Utah, and I can't afford another trashed rental, as it was a new car and we couldn't pick the lock. So I hitched a ride to the nearest payphone and called a locksmith out of Tehachapi. We took a few pictures after I returned. 2 hours later, a new-to-the-job locksmith arrived. Another 2 hours after that, he got the door open. At some point during the ordeal, John made an offhand pithy remark that had I found a thief on the street in Bakersfield, he would have had the door open in 5 minutes. I then had to plead with the frustrated locksmith not to pick up his tools and leave us stranded. I understood John's frustration, as we had come many miles to visit Tehachapi, but I am grateful for those trips we did have, quality over quantity, and a good, strong, long-distance friendship. I miss him so very much. Thank you, Doug Harrop, for those memories. Now we'll jump back toward the Midwest with memories of John from Mike Schaefer, with this wonderful view of a Sioux Line local looking through the schoolyard in Baldwin, North Dakota in July of 1980. From 1972 to his untimely passing in 2005, John Bjorklund was always among my top choices of friends to travel with on rail photography journeys. Guaranteed with John, you'd get great photos and have a great, maybe even hilarious time while you're at it. This was all particularly important to me, for whom railfen trips are social events as much as they are historical expeditions. Don't get me wrong, John was as serious as one needed to be to get the job done. Our first meeting occurred in 1971 when I was working for Kalmbach Books. John called me out of the blue in search of a program presenter for the Michigan Railroad Club's annual banquet in Dearborn the following spring. He was insistent on getting me to come over. I was flown to Detroit for the presentation, and so it was at the Detroit airport where I first met John in person. What really blew me away was the banquet itself, held in the elegant ballroom of the prestigious Dearborn Inn. Socializing among the linen-covered tables were men in expensive suits, arm in arm with spouses dressed in floor-length gowns. No railroad patch festooned jackets and choo-choo engineer caps here. We feasted on sumptuous fare, prime rib, turkey, champagne, and the huge ballroom, a far cry from the banquets of pizza and beer at our NRHS chapter back in Rockford. Through it all, John remained unassuming and friendly, always making sure that everything was my liking. He took me around to some of the tables and introduced me to the club luminaries, many destined to become treasured friends. Despite my pre-show jitters, the program apparently came off without a hitch and drew a standing ovation. And so began nearly 3 decades of extensive traveling with John, oftentimes accompanied by one or more of his Detroit area cohorts, chiefly Jim Thomas or M. Goulash, Walt Sardina, or with my notoriously funny buddy Tom Post. With the exception of the strong-willed Emery, John was usually the leader in these forays. Under his mild-mannered aura was a determined man who knew where he wanted to go and what he wanted to record on film as a result. John's penchant was to tackle slices of railroading, often, if not always, overlooked by the mainstream railfan movement of that era. He would do his homework before and sometimes during any new adventure, calling knowledgeable friends for information, waltzing into the depot to grill the operator. John was always able to mine railroad employees for nuggets of information. Apparently, I had made some sort of impression on John, for in the weeks following my MRC banquet presentation, he called me to talk railroading and photography. Soon this led to plans for some rail fanning together, and in July of '72, John and Jim made an expedition to Chicago, where with friends Bob Schmidt and Mel Patrick, we gave them a 2-week rail-related tour of my honorary hometown. This was the trip where I met the real John Bjorklund, a John unencumbered by suits or banquet festivities. John's unassuming but warm and friendly and apparently very conservative side was still there, of course, but I worried about what his reaction might be to the real Mike Schaefer. These trips were never without John's unique brand of wry, good-natured humor that always reminded us not to take things too seriously. Indeed, John celebrated rail fanning, for in the big picture, it was all about fun and camaraderie. At the end of a good day of photography, he would make it a point to seek out a decent restaurant, one that would make hardcore cheapskate fans blanch at the prices, where we could review the day's triumphs and fumbles over a good filet and wine. One evening it was at the trendy dining room of the Hilton in Corning, New York, following a glorious fall day when John, Jim, and I explored the Erie Lackawanna. I guess if there was one trip with John that stood above all the others for me, it was a circle trip through the extremes of Ohio in the spring of 1979. We decided it was time to focus on the Detroit, Toledo, and Ironton, a railroad far more interesting than existing information and coverage of the same would have you believe. Thanks to Jim's planning, our cumulative coverage of the DT&I during the course of this 4-day trip was nothing short of stellar. Once again, the MRC had flown me to Detroit to give a program. After which the four of us launched an overnight drive in Jim's Ford van to Springfield, Ohio, where we caught a southbound morning DT&I freight leaving town. Our rambles along both main and branch line of the DT&I brought us to Gallipolis, in the southeastern part of the state along the Ohio River, at the end of day 2, and with it the question, what railroad should we follow back north? John casually mentioned the old T&OC, the Toledo and Ohio Central, as a possibility. I had never heard of it, and he then went on to describe how this former New York Central line was the Central's tap into West Virginia for coal, which tunneled and turned its way through southeastern Ohio terrain that between Point Pleasant and Columbus was anything but level. We were sold, and the following 2 days were spent shooting a part of Conrail that few have ever witnessed. Our dinner that night, with wine and, except for me, after dinner cigars, was in New Lexington, Ohio, on the 3rd night of the trip. Over the 30-plus years I knew him, I watched his work evolve from the occasional haphazard to the breathtakingly why didn't I see that genre. At one time, he was probably learning from me, now I was learning from him. As always, though, his work came with humbleness and modesty, flattered that I or anyone else would want to use it in books and magazines being worked on. John's serious side to railroad photography was his constant quest to improve it. He did this in part by asking questions about what we thought about how he handled a particular shot, or in part by simply observing the work of others as slideshows and in publications. Throughout the wanderings of that long weekend, John and the rest of us were in full bloom with ongoing humorous barbs to one another. Jokes about the livestock I used as props in my photos, jabs about John's Swedish ancestry, and philosophical discussions about life in general and railroads in particular. En route back to Detroit on the fourth day as twilight settled in over the northern Ohio farmlands, we encountered a northbound DT&I freight near Hamler, which we set up for and recorded as the last photo of the trip. Nope, not quite, I said. We needed one more photo, a closure scene that posed all of us up against Jim's mud-splattered van that shows the four explorers after their exuberant weekend plus. A copy of that photo now hangs above my desk, and I've been glancing at it for inspiration as I pen this tribute. Sometimes I wish I could jump right back into that picture and then back into 1979. John is kneeling in the scene, almost like a sign he would be the first among us to fall to the inevitable end-of-life cycle. But in this photo of 42 years ago, I find solace in how lucky I've been to be blessed with good times and true friends, especially people like John Bjorklund. Thank you, Mike. This wonderful 1971 view of the Canadian Pacific crew switching a mail storage boxcar into the head end of the Canadian in Calgary leads us to the final tribute, this from Michael Ross Valentine. It's easy to think of famous or great published photographers as influences, but it's vastly different when you have contact on a personal level with someone who has directly inspired you. For me, it is easy to think of John Bjorklund as an inspiration in my own photography and, more importantly, in life. I knew John growing up in Michigan from attending the slideshows in my teenage years, and always thought his work was outstanding and had a unique quality about it that was distinctly different. I left the state in 1989, returning to Metro Detroit again in 1999. There is a great group of local photographers who meet on Tuesdays twice a month, known as Tuesday Night Live, TNL. Fortunately, John, as well as the late Emery Goulash, were also members. This gave me a chance to see more of John's work and to get to know him as a friend. I'm glad I did. While I always admired John's work, when I was younger, I didn't understand photography and the importance of a passage of time like I do now. It was not until I moved back and had the opportunity to see more of John's work that I realized just what a gifted photographer he was. Back in the early 70s, John was creating emotion-filled images, sunsets, telephotos, wide angles, what he termed mood shots. This at a time when the rail photography world was still stuck in the 50mm wedge mode. It seems while many people took train photos, John's works just seemed to ooze of railroading and were clearly at a different level. At the Tuesday night shows, John would always bring a Logan box. We would all wonder if it was going to be a square corners night. For the younger generation, earlier Kodak slides were mounted in square corner mounts, which meant to us John was digging into the archives with some of the older gems. He never wanted to be the person who showed slides after John, as he was a tough act to follow. What would flash across the screen was often mind-blowing DNHPAs in perfect fall colors, an obscure Milwaukee Road branch line in the Dakotas or Minnesota with a bunch of SW1s, or an SPNS or Burlington Northern Alco on the inside gateway, a short line on decrepit track in the rainy pine groves of Louisiana, or a Union Pacific branch line he chased in the 70s in Idaho, which has long since been torn up. A foggy morning sunrise on the N&W in West Virginia, or the Erie Lackawanna splitting the semaphores, it never seemed to end. For the fun of it, fortunately, I don't think he caught on to my little game. I would mention to him some obscure line operation I'd heard about, but never seen any photos of. Much to my chagrin and that of the other attendees, he would be there 2 Tuesdays later with amazing photos of said operation, usually taken on a sunny day with Alcos or F units just to make it that much sweeter. John has been published mostly in books and magazines. He has produced a far-reaching body of work that is quite remarkable, and in many cases of quite rare subjects. While his photos will live on, what has sadly passed is John's commentary. He had a mind like a microfilm warehouse. He would remember details about a place or location that were amazing. What was best was his dry sense of humor, as John often wouldn't say much. But when he did, it was often a pithy comment, one that was out of the blue, that would have you laughing long, long after the punchline. And it was usually always 100% on target. I miss that the most. Tuesday night live meetings have a short list of rules, about 5, but rule 1 was the slideshow was brought to order by John saying, "Let's see some trains." We now know that John is seeing some trains again. You gave us a wonderful gift of vision and you shared it with us. Thanks, John. Thanks, Michael. I will I will conclude with a few more images of John's. Here, a southbound Ann Arbor sand train is crossing the Grand Trunk at Lakeland, Michigan. Farther down the line, John caught the operator doing a balancing act, placing the orders for the same Ann Arbor train in the rack. Here's one of his recently turned up black and white 35mm negatives. A Clarion and Pittsfield 44-tonner ambles down the road in the rain, passing a Gulf station with nice cheap prices, while opposite a Coca-Cola dealer has returned bottles stacked high. Here a wonderful close-up of a Milwaukee Road SW1 with a steam era bell mounted high above a modernized pile twin beam headlight at the end of the long hood. Here a wonderful image of friend Walt Sardina while he filmed the Erie Lackawanna crew chains in Huntington, Indiana in 1972. Here a hostler fueling a big Alco in Windsor, Ontario, rinsing off the leaked fuel. Or here coal dust flying along the former nickel plate main line as an N&W westbound coal train rolls through Narlow, Ohio in November of '86. Here a family watches on as C&O 614 is westbound with a Chessie Steam Special at Proctor, West Virginia in September of 1980. Making the most of a foggy morning with an EL caboose passing the cemetery at Bypass, Indiana in March of '76. A B&O eastbound at Lodi, Ohio with an old Osgood cable backhoe filling the foreground in January of '78. C&O 614 eastbound through Rockwood, Pennsylvania as a young boy on the left and an old timer on the right look on. Here, many Grand Trunk Western section gangs have gathered together working in Durand, Michigan, all with lining bars in hand, barring a switch into alignment the old-fashioned way in August of 1970, and talk with an Erie Lackawanna crew in Huntington in 1972. Here we have Erie Lackawanna Bicentennial 3632 exiting from the fog in Huntington, Indiana in March of '76. In this funny scene, we find the local townsfolk, along with railroad photographers and even part of the train crew, working to move Burt Reynolds' Smokey and the Bandit Pontiac Trans Am out of the way for this Milwaukee Road local in Brodhead, Minnesota. Another Milwaukee local rolls through Canton, Minnesota behind SW1s, passing no less than 5 pubs in this short block, July of '76. A wonderful classic view of the former Lackawanna Hoboken terminal ticket windows in May of '81. And later, the trains that served that terminal along the former Lackawanna, we have old rivet side MUs at Dover, New Jersey. Another view from climbing high on a signal, which he always liked to do, here at SJ Tower in Lima, Ohio, as Erie Lackawanna E8s are westbound approaching with train orders in the rack, September of '75. Here C&O 614 is impressively pulling to a stall at Mifflin, Pennsylvania, while climbing the former B&O grade out of Pittsburgh in September of '80, and sunset along the former Big Four with the blades at Quincy, March of 1980. Here a perfect illustration of using a telephoto to bring in all the drama and detail as CP70 dramatically departs Kamoka with the stock cars. However, this one image immediately conveys the artistry that John would pull out of his hat at a moment's notice. It's all there with this eastbound Milwaukee train at Loweth, Montana. These tributes from John's friends have told you of an extraordinary friend and photographer, sharing their stories, adventures, memories, and most importantly, the influence we received in life and photography from our friend. I hope that we have shown you the John Bjorklund that we treasured and wanted to share with others. Thanks, John. To Bon, Scott, Haley, everyone at the center, along with Jim, Mike, Doug, Michael, a heartfelt thank you for your contributions in producing this tribute to John and his work. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Spectacular presentation. And I should also, to Bon's wonderful introduction, I should just also add all of our great thanks at the center, both to you and to Mike Valentine for your excellent and many efforts to make sure that John's collection found a permanent home in the center's archives. It really is a cornerstone of our collections, and I couldn't think of a better example of the Kodachrome era of railroad photography than John Bjorklund's work. So we're really proud to have it in our collections, and can't thank you enough for helping us get it, and now for helping us share it. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you,
Scott.
Scott.
Scott, this is respond to that end. How much of his collection is now archived by the center? I mean, given the presentation, I'm sure there's a lot of people that want to scroll through and see more of it.
Yeah, it's very fully archived. We do have a few images still to receive, including those wonderful black and white negatives that we still need to get that Jeff recently came across. But in terms of the color slides, so we've digitized all 55,000 in our possession, and we've posted a pretty good selection of those on our Flickr stream and on our website. So if you go to our website under the collections tab, you can get to John Bjorklund, and then you can browse the collection there by railroad. And we have galleries from almost all the railroads to photograph. So there's at least a few thousand John Bjorklund photographs available for viewing on our website.
Tip of the iceberg.
It is, yeah, it is that. And we've fulfilled several image requests with those, including a book that was done on the Missouri lines of the Missouri, Kansas, Texas, by an author named Michael Landis, who said that many people told him that it wouldn't be possible to do a book about the Katy in Missouri for lack of photographic coverage. And he was starting to think the same thing until he found us and discovered John's work there. You even used one of John's photographs on the cover of that book.
Nice.
We have time for one or two questions. Do we have any? Have we had any come in, Haley?
I don't see any that come in, but Jeff, I have a question for you. I mean, clearly, John has been such a great mentor to you in so many aspects of your life, particularly photography. What do you recall any of some advice that he gave you when you were just starting out, maybe something that's really stuck with you over the years?
No, he didn't really say much. I mean, he was great to travel with. He was a riot. But I just learned a lot from just the way he handled himself and the way he worked images. I mean, everybody has their own style, but he was unique. Great person to follow and learn from, for sure. Yeah.
Well, I certainly feel like I've gotten to know him a lot better through the presentation today, and what a great format to reach out and get stories and reflections from some of his other traveling companions. That's really a special thing to be able to share today.
Yeah, that I had many. I mean, that's just 4 of them. There was a feature article that was part of, and yeah, it was great to be able to put it together. This was a short program, but it made it work. That's for sure.
Well, thank you again, and thanks for all your great work on our conference over the years, and we'll look forward to taking advantage of the Mast AV technological abilities once we're back in person. Hopefully later this year and next for sure.
Well, we avoided my problem today when the power went out at the beginning of William's show. So
glad it came back on.
It was a little hair raising, yeah.